Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be reading Rebels and Revolutions: True Stories, Real Tales of Radical Change in America by Judy Dodge Cummings. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It would mean a great deal to me if you did. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or just sit back and relax. And let's get to it. Introductions. Are you a rule breaker? Have you ever been ordered to do something that was unfair, such as clean up a mess you did not make or let someone go who rudely cut the line when you'd patiently waited for your turn? Most people encounter unfairness sometime in their lives. What if you were commanded to follow a rule that made you feel like a criminal every day, year in and year out? Disobeying the rule could get you jailed or killed. Would you swallow your pride and follow orders, or stand up for your rights regardless of the consequences? History is full of people who had been labeled troublemakers because they rebelled against rules they believed were unjust. This book tells the stories of 5 real-life rule breakers. Joseph Plum Martin was only 15 when he stood up to the King of England. Joseph joined the Continental Army to help the American colonies fight for independence. When he picked up a musket and vowed to overthrow British rule in America, Joseph became a traitor. If captured, he would be imprisoned and possibly executed. Joseph Plum Martin fought for his country's freedom, but Senjbi Pai fought for his personal freedom. Kidnapped by slave traders in Africa, Senjbi was shackled in the hold of a slave ship headed for America. He broke free from his chains and led fellow captives in a revolt against the ship's crew. The Africans commandeered the ship and tried to sail back to Africa, but the U.S. Navy captured them. Senjbi was imprisoned on murder charges. Members of the Fair Play Committee knew what it meant to lose freedom. When the United States went to war with Japan in 1941, the government moved 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into internment camps. The majority of these people were American citizens. Their crime? A Japanese heritage. In 1944, the government began drafting the men held in the camps to fight in the war. A group that called itself the Fair Play Committee refused to go along refused to go along with the draft until families were released from the camps. Fair Play Committee members wanted their families to be allowed to go home. The government refused and charged members of the group with treason. Claudette Colvin did not live behind bars, but she did live in a kind of prison. As a black teenager growing up in Alabama in the 1950s, racist laws restricted her life in many miserable ways. One day, Claudette's tolerance for these rules ran out. She refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white woman. Claudette was arrested. Cesar Chavez also lived with the injustices of racial discrimination. A Mexican-American migrant worker, he toiled in the fields of California. Long hours, low wages, and brutal conditions kept his family and other farm laborers in poverty. Caesar became the voice of these workers. He stood up to the agricultural industry and demanded better working conditions for the people who labor to pick the nation's fruits and vegetables. These 5 individuals fought for their rights and changed history. Their stories might inspire you to become a rebel for the right cause. And isn't that what we're seeing nowadays, my dear friends? With everything that's going on, it's only been a month, and already so many things have changed. So many things have gotten worse. How much more are we gonna just endure? Chapter 1: Soldier of the Revolution. The morning of April 21st, 1775, church bells clanged in the small town of Milford, Connecticut, followed by 3 rapid gunshots. Joseph Plum Martin, who was 15 years old, put down his plow and looked at his grandfather in alarm. "I smell a rat," grandfather said. Without another word, he steered the horse cart for home. Joseph sniffed. That was no rat he smelled. It was war. This is the true tale of Joseph Plum Martin, a boy who rebelled against the greatest power in the world of the 18th century, the British Empire. He did it in defense of his country and his brothers in arms. Joseph Plum Martin was born in 1760 in Becket, Massachusetts. His father was a pastor who frequently moved. When Joseph was 7, his parents sent him to live with his grandparents on the farm outside Milford, Connecticut. During the 1960s, the American colonies began to resist trade restrictions placed on them by their mother country, Great Britain. When the Great British Parliament taxed molasses imports, the colonists smuggled in barrels of the syrupy stuff instead of paying the extra fee. When Great Britain required newspapers and playing cards to be printed on paper that was taxed, Americans boycotted these goods. As Joseph grew older, the chasm between Great Britain and America grew deeper. The colonists objected to the arrival of British troops in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1768, sent by the King of England to maintain order. During a chaotic protest on March 5, 1770, British soldiers shot and killed 5 colonists in an incident named the Boston Massacre. Tensions simmered as the months passed. On the evening of December 16, 1773, more than 100 colonists climbed aboard 3 British ships moored in Boston Harbor. The colonists destroyed 340 chests of tea. They tossed 92,000 pounds of the stuff into the sea to protest the British tax on tea. Joseph was only 13, but he understood a line had been crossed. Outrage swept across Britain. Parliament closed down Boston Harbor and banned town meetings throughout New England. People in Milford began to speak of war. This talk made Joseph nervous. He was convinced He must be a coward. What, he wrote years later, venture my carcass where butterlets fly. That will never do for me. But his attitude changed that morning in 1775 when the church bells pealed. Joseph did not follow grandfather home. Instead, he headed to the village. The boys and men of the community were gathered at Clark's tavern. Their blood running high, Joseph soon learned why. On April 19th, British troops had fired on colonial militia in Lexington, Massachusetts, called Redcoats. The British soldiers killed 8 men. Later that day, American militia and the Redcoats battled in nearby Concord, and more men died on both sides. War was no longer a rumor. At Clark's Tavern, men were being paid to enlist in the Continental Army to defend the American colonies from the British. New recruits would head out in just days. The sight of the money caused seeds of courage to sprout in Joseph, but he was too young to enlist without his grandfather's permission. Grandfather refused to give it, and Joseph sank into a glum silence. The morning the recruits left Milford, Joseph marched with them to the town line. Some of his friends had enlisted, and envy filled Joseph's heart. When the fighting ended, these buddies would swagger back to town, bragging about all their hair-breadth escapes. Joseph would have no stories to tell. Oh, he thought, that was too much to be borne by me. Days passed. Joseph tilled the same fields and milked the same cows. Each day was just like the one before. Joseph considered enlisting without his grandfather's permission, but just could not do it. His grandparents had always been kind and generous, but if they ever did something really unfair, Joseph decided he would enlist in the army in a heartbeat, without a speck of guilt. Although he knew it was rotten, Joseph began to pray that his grandparents would wrong him in some way. In the fall, Joseph's prayers were answered. One thing Joseph loved was his grandfather's play days. After weeks of hard work during spring planting and fall harvesting, Joseph was allowed a full day with no work. In the fall of 1775, Grandfather said that as soon as the winter grain crop was planted, Joseph could have a play day. Joseph wanted to attend a graduation ceremony in nearby New Haven. "You shall go," Grandfather promised. "You shall have your choice of our horses to ride there, and I will give you some pocket money." Joseph and his friends concocted 1,001 plans for the fun they would have. 2 days before the graduation, Grandfather sent Joseph to rake hay in a nearby salt marsh. These swampy grasslands are created when silt washes over coastal lowlands. Farmers cut the salt marsh hay with scythes, and once it dried, they racked it into haycocks. These rounded piles protected the grass from moisture until it could be carted away. On graduation day, Joseph woke early, but grandfather was not there. Joseph could not leave without his permission, so he paced the kitchen impatiently. Finally, grandfather returned. "Come, get up the team," he said before Joseph could say a word. "I've hired the neighbor boy today. The three of us are going to haul the hay home from the salt marsh." Joseph would never refuse an order from his grandfather nor backtalk him. Still, Joseph was determined to let grandfather know how angry and hurt he was at this betrayal. Joseph harnessed the horses to the cart, but he did not climb beside grandfather. Instead, he walked to the salt marsh. On the way, he saw his friends, who were headed to New Haven for the graduation. "Your grandsire never intended to let you go, and you was a fool to believe him," one boy said, as his buddies headed off for their day of fun. Joseph stewed. By mid-afternoon, grandfather, the hired boy, and Joseph had loaded the wagon, but more hay stood in the lower marsh. This swampy section was no place to drive a horse team. Once dusk fell, grandfather might accidentally steer the horses into a bog. If a horse sank, it could break its leg. "I'll drive the team home and unload the cart. You boys move the rest of the hay off the marsh to the high ground. Have it ready when I return." With grandfather gone, the rebellion that had been smoldering inside Joseph all morning burst into flames. "Now is the time for me to show my spunk," he thought. Apple trees, heavy with ripe fruit, grew on the hillside above the marsh. Joseph picked some and stretched out on the ground under the shade of a tree. The hired boy joined him, but as minutes ticked by, the boy grew nervous. "We'd best get back to work," the boy said. Joseph took another chomp of his apple. After much begging, the hired boy finally talked Joseph down to the lower marsh, but there was no fire in Joseph's limbs on this afternoon. The boys had only removed one haycock from the field when grandfather returned to the cart. The old man was livid. "Who is to blame?" grandfather demanded. Joseph folded his arms across his chest and said nothing. The hired boy pointed at Joseph. Grandfather grabbed the 6-foot whip he used on the horses and flew at his grandson. Joseph ran. Other people haying that day watched the scene. Joseph ran at top speed, dodging behind trees and leaping over bushes. The old man clambered after him, whip in hand, face as red as a tomato, but Joseph was far too nimble for grandfather to catch. The crowd burst into laughter. Embarrassed, grandfather gave up and returned to the cart. Perhaps spurred on by fury, grandfather threw caution to the wind and drove the cart onto the marsh. Joseph returned and helped fill the wagon, but remained out of grandfather's reach. As weeks went by, Joseph nursed his anger over being denied his payday. Grandfather's broken promise would be Joseph's passport into the army. Following the bloodshed in Lexington and Concord, Leaders from the 13 colonies had formed the Second Continental Congress. Throughout the summer and fall of 1775, they debated the future of America. Some leaders wanted to make peace with Great Britain, while others wanted the colonies to be declared independent. As Joseph listened to neighbors talk about the possibility of a full-scale war with Great Britain, patriotism surged inside him. Joseph was anxious to be called a defender of my country. In June 1776, recruiters for the Continental Army returned to Milford to enlist soldiers for 6 months' stints. Joseph went to Clark's Tavern every night. He watched men enroll, but always chickened out at the last minute. One night, his friends started teasing him. "If you enlist, I will," said one boy. "You've long been talking about it," said another. "Now is the time." Joseph sat down at the table, and the officer handed him the enlistment forms. As a friend leaned over his shoulder, Joseph held his hand over the form and scribbled his name in the air, careful not to touch the pen to the paper. He was still afraid of taking that final step. Then the boy behind him nudged Joseph's arm. The pen scratched across the enrollment form. "Oh, he had enlisted," said the boy. "He has made his mark." Joseph shrugged. The time for hesitation was over. He signed and dated the form properly. July 6, 1776. Joseph Plum Martin, 3rd Company of the 5th Battalion. At breakfast the next morning, Joseph tried to work up the courage to break the news to his grandparents. Before he could do it, Grandfather said, "Well, you are going a soldiering then, are you?" Although Grandfather had not wanted Joseph to join the army, he gave his grandson everything a soldier needed in 1776. This included a musket, cartridge box, haversack filled with extra clothing, silverware, plate, and cup, tinderbox, razor, comb, and fish hook and twine. Joseph's grandmother also put in cake and cheese in plenty, and my pocket Bible. Joseph knew his grandparents wished me well, soul and body. His rebellion against Grandfather was over, but his resistance against the British was just beginning. In July 1776, thousands of British troops landed on Staten Island, New York. Within striking distance of the vital port of New York City, Joseph's regiment headed to New York City, along with the rest of the Continental Army. At 6 p.m. on July 9, 1776, thousands of Continental soldiers marched to the parade grounds at the Commons in Lower Manhattan. General George Washington announced the news days earlier. The Continental Congress had declared the United Colonies of North America to be free and independent states. Washington ordered the Declaration of Independence be read aloud to the troops. Every soldier gathered on that commons was now committed to a full-scale revolution. It was victory or death. Throughout that summer, Joseph's regiment drilled and drilled and drilled and drilled. Joseph discovered one aspect of military life that would plague him throughout his years in the army: the food. He soon began to miss grandsire's table and cellar. Meanwhile, the British forces on Staten Island swelled. By mid-August, British General William Howe commanded 30 warships, 400 boats, 32,000 soldiers, and 10,000 sailors. Not sure where the British would strike, General Washington divided his 20,000 troops between Manhattan itself and Brooklyn, the section of Long Island that lay across the East River from Manhattan. When British troops landed on Long Island on August 22nd, their target was clear. A large hill known as the Heights runs down the spine of Brooklyn. Washington fortified the hill and concentrated 3,000 soldiers on 3 roads that led to his high ground. However, the general made a nearly fatal mistake. A little known and rarely used trail called Jamaica Pass also led to the heights. British scouts discovered a gap here in the American defenses, and General Howe laid a trap that could have ended the war. On August 26, under the cover of darkness, 10,000 British soldiers silently crept up Jamaica Pass to divert the Americans from this rear assault. 9 British warships sailed straight for Manhattan. General Howe ordered 2 simultaneous attacks against the bulk of the American defenses on the heights. All the American commanders, including General Washington, were caught by surprise when thousands of redcoats hit them from behind. When Joseph and his regiment reached Brooklyn, he confronted the horrors of battle face to face. The wounded and dead lay strewn across the plain, some with broken arms, some with broken legs, and some with broken heads. Joseph's regiment fought a series of skirmishes with the British. They raced through cornfields and woods, dodging musket balls. The men slept on the ground as rain poured down, the growling of their bellies rivaling the boom of thunder. After 2 nights of this, Joseph went to a nearby barn to get dry straw to lie on. The sun was setting when he returned to camp, only to discover the entire regiment marching away. Joseph grabbed his gear and fell into formation. As the men marched, an order came down the lines: absolutely no talking. Wagon wheels were muffled with cloth. Rain sluiced down Joseph's hat as he marched in silence with no idea where he was going. General Washington knew the British encircled the Continental Army. The morning would bring slaughter or surrender. The only escape route lay across the East River to Manhattan. The army marched in silent double time to a ferry landing. Battling rough waves and twisting currents, a company of Massachusetts fishermen rowed the army across the river, 1 boatload at a time. Joseph's feet touched Manhattan at 3 in the morning. Many Americans still waited on the banks of Long Island. When dawn broke, the British would spot these troops and capture or kill them. Before the sun rose, fog thick as pea soup descended over the harbor. Hidden by the mist, the entire Continental Army escaped. When the fog cleared, the British discovered their enemy had vanished. The American rebellion was not over. And this is where we are going to leave it, my dear friends. Tune in next video to hear how this ends. This has been Ruby, signing off.